The rain had already stopped when dawn broke over the Ferrari estate, leaving the world washed in silver. Mist clung to the manicured hedges and marble fountains, softening the edges of power. From the outside, the mansion looked eternal. Columns rising like ancient sentinels, windows glinting with cold precision. But inside, it carried the weight of something unfinished. Grief, perhaps, or guilt disguised as order. At 5 o'clock, the only sound came from the small servants' corridor at the back of the house, a soft rustle of fabric, the faint rattle of porcelain. Sarah Thompson moved like a shadow through the dim light, the hem of her uniform brushing the tiled floor. Every motion was quiet, calculated, practiced. She had learned in this house that silence was not just obedience, it was survival. She tied her hair into a low knot, fingers trembling as she glanced at the cracked mirror nailed to the wall above the sink. A faint reflection stared back at her. 26, tired but still young enough to hope. Pale skin that refused to hide her emotions. Eyes the color of warm amber that always gave her away. She pinched her cheeks to summon color, then adjusted the white apron until the fabric lay perfectly flat. The mirror caught the tremor of her breath. "You're fine," she whispered to herself. "Just breathe." Down the hall, the grandfather clock struck once, a single metallic echo that meant the same thing every morning. Time to begin. She took her cleaning cart and started the routine that had become a kind of ritual. The marble floors gleamed even before she polished them, but she knew every smudge, every hairline crack. She could tell when the roses outside were trimmed just by the way their perfume drifted through the kitchen vents. The house was alive in her memory, mapped through sound and scent. She knew its moods better than her own. At 6, she entered the study, his study. It was forbidden territory to most of the staff. Only Sarah was allowed inside now, not because she was trusted, but because she was invisible. That was how Luca Ferrari preferred his world. Quiet, ordered, untouched by reminders of what he had lost. The room smelled faintly of whiskey and cedar wood. Heavy curtains blocked the sunrise, leaving stripes of light on the polished mahogany desk. There were framed photographs scattered across the shelves, smiling faces from another lifetime. A woman with sunlit hair. Her laughter frozen in glass. Sarah's hand hovered above one of the frames but never touched. She could almost hear the echo of her own restraint. Every morning she dusted the same shelf, careful not to shift anything, careful not to disturb the past. Then, just as she turned toward the door, the quiet changed. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The kind that belonged to someone who owned the floor he walked on. She froze. Her pulse hammered so loudly she thought he might hear it. Luca Ferrari appeared in the doorway, dressed in a charcoal suit, though it was barely 6:30. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of presence that filled a room before he spoke. His eyes, a stormy steel blue, scanned her briefly before moving to the desk. "Leave the curtains," he said, voice low, controlled. "I like the light this way." Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Her voice always came out softer around him, like the air thinned whenever he entered. She stepped back to let him pass, heart beating against her ribs. He didn't look at her again. Not really. To him she was a function, coffee appearing at his elbow, papers neatly stacked, silence perfectly kept. He took the cup she'd prepared, sipped, and frowned slightly. "You added sugar?" "Only half a spoon, sir. You seemed—" She stopped herself. He raised an eyebrow. "I seemed?" Her throat went dry. "Tired. Yesterday." For a heartbeat, nothing. Then he exhaled through his nose and set the cup down. "You noticed too much." She lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." His tone softened, but only by degrees. Noticing is useful. Speaking isn't. The words should have stung, but somehow they didn't. He wasn't cruel, just distant. His grief had built walls around him thicker than the marble ones enclosing the estate. Sarah watched from the corner of her eye as he opened a file and leaned back in his chair, the light catching the streaks of silver beginning to thread through his dark hair. He was only 35, but loss had aged him faster than time ever could. Outside, thunder murmured far away, promising another storm. She finished the dusting and stepped out of the study, closing the door without sound. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall, exhaling the breath she'd been holding. He'd spoken more words to her today than in the past month combined. By midday, the house was awake. Staff moved quietly through the hallways. Deliveries arrived through the side gate. The kitchen buzzed with the muted rhythm of service. Sarah preferred the quieter tasks, the upper floors, the rooms no one entered anymore. They were full of ghosts, but at least ghosts didn't shout. She changed the sheets in the guest rooms, folded towels, arranged fresh lilies in crystal vases. The routine numbed her thoughts until she caught her reflection again, this time in the tall mirror at the end of the hallway. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. The girl staring back looked fragile but resolute, as if carrying a secret she hadn't decided to confess. "You shouldn't stare," a voice said behind her. She jumped. It was Marco, one of the guards. Young, friendly, maybe too friendly. He grinned, holding a tray of mail. "You'll start believing the mirror if you keep that up." "I was just checking the dust," she lied quickly. He chuckled. "Sure you were. You going to the staff dinner tonight?" Sarah shook her head. "I have work." "Sarah, we all have work. Doesn't mean we can't eat." She smiled politely but said nothing. He hesitated, shrugged, and left. The silence that followed was oddly comforting. She wasn't used to attention, not even harmless attention. The only eyes she wanted to notice her never did. As the day wore on, clouds gathered again. By 5 p.m., the sky turned the color of pewter, and rain began tapping against the windows. She finished early, then walked through the corridor toward the service wing. That was when she heard it. Music. Piano notes. Low, hesitant, like someone relearning how to feel. The sound came from the east wing. From the music room no one entered anymore. She followed it, heartbeat syncing with the rhythm. Through the cracked door, she saw him, Luca, sitting at the grand piano. His jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, fingers gliding hesitantly across the keys. The melody faltered, stopped, then began again. Sarah should have turned back. Instead, she watched, entranced. The rainlight softened his face, made him human again, stripped of the armor he wore around others. Each note seemed to carve a piece out of his silence. He wasn't the ruthless Ferrari the city whispered about. He was a man learning how to remember without breaking. A floorboard creaked beneath her weight. He looked up sharply. Their eyes met through the narrow gap of the door, hers wide, startled, his unreadable. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then his voice, calm but firm. "Come in." She hesitated. "I didn't mean to. Come in," he repeated. She stepped inside, soaked in guilt and rainlight. The room smelled of old wood and faint cologne. "I was just cleaning the hall," she murmured. "And spying?" he asked, but there was no bite in it. "I'm sorry." He studied her, fingers resting on the piano keys. "Do you play?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." "Not anymore," he echoed. "That means you once did." "A long time ago," she admitted. "Before life got in the way." He nodded slowly, eyes thoughtful. Life has a talent for that. Silence stretched between them, fragile and strange. Then he gestured toward the piano bench. "Sit." Her heart raced. "Sir, I can't." "It's not an order, it's an invitation." The word felt foreign coming from him. Invitation. She crossed the room and sat beside him, careful not to brush his sleeve. He played a few more notes, quieter now. "I used to play with my wife," he said softly. "She loved Chopin. The house feels empty without it." Sarah's breath caught. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. He turned slightly and for the first time really looked at her. "You're different from the others. You don't fill the silence. You listen to it." "I suppose silence is safer," she said. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just another kind of prison." She looked at him then, at the man everyone feared but no one truly knew. And in that instant she saw it. The grief behind the strength, the loneliness hidden beneath control. The clock in the hall struck 6, shattering the fragile spell. He stood abruptly, the moment folding into air. "Thank you, Miss Thompson. That's enough for today." She rose as well, smoothing her skirt. "Yes, sir." But as she turned to leave, he said quietly, "The coffee this morning, it wasn't too sweet. You were right. I was tired." She froze, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, sir." When she stepped into the corridor, the rain had started again, heavier this time. The mansion groaned under its weight, as if remembering something it wanted to forget. Sarah walked back to her room, every nerve alive, carrying the echo of piano notes and the realization that, for the first time, Luca Ferrari had seen her. Not as a shadow, not as a servant, but as someone real. Still, she didn't understand what that meant yet. She only knew the silence had changed. And somewhere behind her, in a room filled with ghosts and music, Luca stared at the door she had just closed, wondering why her absence suddenly felt louder than the rain. Morning came heavy and bright. A curtain of light dragged across the Atlantic until it pooled in the Ferrari windows like molten glass. The house inhaled coffee and discipline. It exhaled a hush that dared the world to try again. Sarah rose before the sun, as always, but something in her moved slower, the way a song lingers after the last note, the way a hand hesitates above a closed door. Last night's piano had not left her. She had gone to bed with Chopin under her skin and woken up with the echo of Luca Ferrari's voice in her throat. She pinned her hair, smoothed her apron, and reached for the small, worn notebook she hid beneath the folded uniforms in her drawer. It was cheap and soft at the corners, smudged by a life that didn't offer her many things to hold. She had begun writing in it the week she arrived, not to be read, to breathe. Pages filled with little truths that had nowhere else to go. The way fog moves like a living thing. The way power looks heavier up close. The way a man can stand perfectly still and still rearrange a room. "You never speak to me," she had written once, "but I have learned your silence." She tucked the notebook into the deep pocket of her skirt, told herself she would not add to it today, and joined the machinery of morning. At precisely 6:37, she slid into the study with his coffee. The room was angled to the east, blinds half open, and the light there could be cruel, sharper on truth than any afternoon sun. He was already at the desk, jacket on the chair, vest buttoned, tie pinned perfectly, sleeves unrolled. He had the look of a man who didn't intend to let the day dig its fingers in. "Good morning," she said, setting the tray down. He answered without looking up. "Good morning, Miss Thompson." She turned the handle of the cup toward his dominant hand, felt the tiny, now familiar thrill of knowing something no one had taught her, and stepped back. He looked up then, and for a second, did not look away. The glance hardly lasted a breath, but she felt it as a change in the air, a small pressure in her lungs. "You were in the music room yesterday," he said. Her pulse kicked. "I was in the corridor." "You were listening," he corrected, not unkindly. She swallowed. "Yes, sir." A pause. "Then you heard where I misremembered the left hand," he said, and the corner of his mouth notched as if the sentence cost less than it would have yesterday. "I'm out of practice." "Practice comes back," she said before she could stop the hope in her voice. "Faster than you think." He considered that, then the coffee, then her again. "Perhaps," he allowed and lifted the cup. "Thank you for not pretending you weren't there." "I'm better at pretending when no one asks me to," she said softly. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and then wasn't. Honest and quiet, a dangerous combination. "Only for me," she replied. "Perhaps not only for you," he said, but his eyes had already slid to the document he'd been reading, and the spell broke as gently as it had formed. She finished her work in the study with the precision the room demanded. On her way out, she noticed the edge of a ledger pulled half an inch from the shelf, his order for the day already spilling beyond the desk. Without thinking, she reached to push it back flush. The movement tugged at her skirt, the pocket gaped, and the notebook slipped out and hit the rug with a sound too soft to register as danger. She would have missed it if he had not looked up at exactly the moment it fell. His gaze dropped to the small black book lying on the carpet. Sarah bent, heat firing through her, but he was faster. He picked it up with those careful hands that knew both gentleness and threat, and for one heartbeat she saw something on his face that looked like curiosity dressed as caution. "Yours?" he asked. Her mouth had gone dry. "Yes." "And what do you keep so close you'd bring it into this room?" She reached for it. "Just lists." "Lists," he repeated, as if she had offered him a code he was tempted to break. He did not step back. He unfolded a gesture that wasn't quite refusal and wasn't quite permission, and opened the notebook to its middle the way men open doors, the way they choose where to stand. Words stared up at him. Her handwriting was small and quick, letters knit tight when she was afraid, looser when she felt safe enough to be wrong. He read a line. His eyes changed. He read another, and the line of his jaw hardened. Not with anger, she realized, but with the violent effort of being seen without warning. He closed the notebook. Not harshly, precisely. "This is not a house for tender pages," he said, voice even. "Finish here." He slid the notebook into his vest pocket as if it were evidence he intended to guard against the world. "Then meet me at 11 in the East Garden." "Sir!" The room seemed to tilt under her feet. "Please." 11, he said, and was already moving toward the door. The conversation shelved under things that would happen whether she could breathe through them or not. Time became a room with no windows. She measured it in tasks, silver polished, glass reset, lilies trimmed to the right thirst. 11 approached like a verdict no one would read aloud. She had the nausea of a woman standing on a dock as a storm decides whether or not it knows her name. At 10:59, she stood by the glass doors that led to the East Garden. The sea hunched under a sky that had not yet decided about rain. The hedges along the balustrade glittered with the last of dawn. She laid her palm against the cool pane, as if that could keep her steady when nothing else could. He came at 11, perfectly on time. A man who married himself to schedules because chaos always asked him to dance. No jacket, vest still on. Tie loosened half an inch. He had put the morning back together enough to face the afternoon and left the evening for later. He stopped a pace away, near enough to be weather, far enough to be honorable. He touched his pocket, the one where her pages lay, and the smallest of smiles ghosted his mouth. "You write like a person who survived being unheard." She felt the blunt kindness of the sentence like sunlight at the end of a long haul. "I write because there's nowhere to put the days," she said. "If I don't, they put me somewhere instead." "I know something about that," he said, and the way he said it told her not to ask. Wind rattled the glass. The ocean pulled the horizon a fraction closer. "You wrote truth," he continued. "It unsettled me. I'm sorry. Don't be." His eyes held hers. Unsettled is still alive. He looked over her shoulder at the roses, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed key by half a step. "A year ago, a reporter wrote that I don't grieve, I manage." He thought it was an insult. "It's simply the language I speak best. Your pages were not management. They were witnessing." She didn't realize she had stepped closer until she felt the heat of his presence. She had seen him at a distance every day for months. Up close, he was altogether different. The scar near his right brow was a fading parenthesis around a story he had never told anyone who wasn't already gone. The hairs at his temple tilted silver under the light because he had long ago stopped asking his life to wait. "I won't keep it," he said, nodding to his pocket, the notebook warm now with his body. "But I won't give it back until I understand why I was allowed to read it." "I didn't allow it," she said, the smallest laugh uncoiling from somewhere scared. "I dropped it like a fool." He shook his head. "There are 100 rooms in this house where something can fall and never be seen. It fell in front of me." He let that hang between them, then sealed it with a simple, practical truth. "There's a gala tonight, the kind with long lenses. I will be what they need me to be for 4 hours. I want you nowhere near it. Stay in the upper hall. If you need air, use the east loggia. No silhouettes on the grand staircase, no balcony." Yes, Mr. Fair. Luca, he said, and she felt her name change inside his. When it's only us, and only if you choose to. She couldn't force sound through her throat. The syllables waited like a secret that knew it would be found. He spared her, looked briefly toward the cliffs, and when he looked back, there was something ironic and fragile at once trying to live in his mouth. Do you always love in silence, Sarah? The world narrowed to the size of an intake of air. A gull wrote a white line across the sky. The sea answered the question with another question, and neither of them had grammar enough for it. She shook her head, and it could have meant, no, I don't love, or no, not always, or no, not if you're asking like that. He did not press. Men who have lost things to pressure learn when not to apply it. He inclined his head, and she felt the conversation end without being concluded. Stay where I asked you to, for your sake, for mine. For yours? The words surprised them both. I am more careful when you're somewhere I can predict, he said simply, and I need to be careful tonight. Because of the lenses? She asked. Because of the men who hold them. He paused, then, because he had already given her more than he meant to, added one more truth. Some of them take pictures, some take aim. He left her there with the wind on her face and her name in his mouth. The garden did not change shape, but she had. The house felt different too, as if the marble had softened an inch, as if the chandeliers understood something beyond electricity. The day spilled forward like a glass filled too high. Florists came and went, threading garlands through banisters. The quartermaster laid out cutlery that had outlived dynasties. Security walked the perimeter until the hedges learned their names. Sarah folded napkins into small, expensive swans that would die at the first spill of red wine. The smallness of the work calmed her. The bigness of what waited did not. At 4, she climbed the service stair to the linen pantry, a narrow room that smelled of starch and sleep. She closed the door and leaned back against it, pressing her eyes shut until the pulse behind them softened. She told herself she would retrieve the notebook tonight and burn it in the sink, then tell the truth only to the things that could not repeat it: stone, ocean, night. A shadow crossed the threshold under the door. She straightened as the handle turned. The door opened 5 inches and stopped. Luca stood there, tie loosened a degree, cufflinks in his hand, a man changing armor between battles. You came to hide, he said. I came to breathe, she answered, which in her language was the same thing. He stepped inside and the small room learned his angles. The scent of cedar and some distant tobacco clung to him like memory clings to the softest fabric. He lifted the notebook from his vest and held it out. She didn't move. I read 1 page, he said. Then I stopped. Why? Because I am learning to leave some doors closed, he said, quiet and factual. Take it. She reached. Their fingers brushed, skin to skin, no more than a rehearsal for a touch that would not be written. The book felt warmer than when she'd lost it. She slipped it back into her pocket, conscious that she was returning a heartbeat to its ribcage. You were right about one thing, he said, turning the cufflink with his thumb. Silence is safer. It is also expensive. What does it cost? She asked again. Company, he said simply, and belief. The pantry felt suddenly too small for oxygen. He turned as if to go, then stopped. If you look down from the mezzanine tonight, do it only once. If you can't help looking twice, leave. Twice is how people get noticed. She smiled despite the way her nerves trembled. And you? I was noticed the day I was born, he said dryly. I've been negotiating the terms ever since. He left her with that, and she sank against the shelves and laughed once, a helpless, quiet sound that might have been a sob with better posture. By 8 o'clock, the house glittered like a promise it intended to keep. Guests arrived in black cars that knew where to stop without being told. The orchestra tested the air and found it clear. The chandeliers chose a wattage that flattered money and made sin look like lacquer. From the mezzanine shadow, Sarah watched the world he had survived to own. He moved through it like gravity. Things fell into place as he passed. He was a practiced host, a precise smile, a glass lifted and never quite emptied. Every so often he glanced toward the upper hall, not enough to draw a lens, enough to steady her if she was watching. She told herself to look once. She failed. Twice, their gazes crossed. The second time, he tipped his chin a fraction. She stepped back into shadow, obeying. Pulse taxied to the edge of takeoff and held there. On the far side of the ballroom, two men she did not recognize stood too still for celebration. One wore a tuxedo that fit like a lie. The other's smile stopped at the teeth. Nothing about them was illegal. Everything about them was wrong. She didn't know the words for the world they came from, but the house did. Its wiring tightened, and the head of security's hand moved to the earpiece as gently as a man moves to touch a sleeping child. Down in the main room, a society columnist raised her phone and aimed it at the room's most photogenic axis. Luca in profile, a chandelier blazing above him like a crown, the empty space where a woman belonged beside him. Sarah felt the shot land without seeing the flash. She put a hand to her stomach without meaning to and stepped farther back. Behind her, cool air crept through the service hall, smelling of rain. She could have returned to the attic, hidden with clean sheets and the faithfulness of dust. She didn't. She stood where the marble met darkness and let the moment right itself. Below, he looked up one last time, and the way his gaze found the place where she wasn't said more than any vow she had ever heard. The orchestra lifted a waltz that wasn't Chopin but wanted to be. A waiter passed too close to the men who didn't belong. One of them jolted, and his jacket opened just enough to show a shape that lived only in dangerous clothing. The head of security turned his head and did not appear to turn his head at all. Sarah pressed herself flatter against the column and thought, he asked me to be careful so he could spend what courage he had only once tonight, not on me. She wondered what it would cost, this carefulness, what it would buy, this staying unseen. A door breathed somewhere near the terrace. Wind moved through the chandeliers with a voice like a match struck and blown out again. She looked only once more and saw him lift a glass while not drinking, smile while not surrendering, and carry the weight of a house that had decided to live again. He had asked her a question in the garden and let her leave it unanswered. Now a new one formed in the air between them, larger, heavier, louder than violins. What happens to a man who is master of every gaze when, for the first time, he risks looking back? By late afternoon, the mansion had shed its quiet skin. Lighting rigs glowed like tame constellations above the ballroom. A string quartet tuned in murmurs, and the caterers moved in crisp, choreographed lines through a scent of lemon zest and seared filet. Outside, the Atlantic threw glassy light against the windows as if the sea itself felt expected. Sarah spent the day one floor above the spectacle, a ghost with a checklist. She ironed table linens that would never know her name, counted crystal flutes by the rack, refolded napkins into swans that would die with the first spill of champagne. She kept to the service hallways the head butler had assigned. No loitering near the grand staircase, no lingering on balconies, no staff silhouettes and photographs, yet the hum beneath her ribs refused to obey. Every step she took aligned with another step she'd taken that morning, toward Luca's voice, toward the place where Sir had become Luca, and truth had been allowed to breathe. At 4:12 p.m. She reached for a stack of monogrammed cocktail napkins in the linen pantry, and the door swung inward from the other side. Luca stood framed by the narrow light, tie loosened, cufflinks undone, an immaculate storm. For a heartbeat, they stared. The pantry, no wider than a confession, captured his cologne, cedar, salt, smoke, and fed it back to her like a dare. "You followed instructions," he said softly. "I'm trying," she answered, meaning, "I'm trying not to look for you in every reflection." His gaze dipped to the tremor she couldn't command out of her hands. "Good." He took one crisp step inside and reached past her shoulder, touching nothing, touching everything, for an invisible something on the top shelf. The movement brushed his sleeve against the cotton of her uniform. Fabric to fabric, spark to tinder. He paused as if measuring the danger, then withdrew. A man who could win a war and lose to a pulse. "Stay to the upper corridors tonight. If you need fresh air, use the east loggia, no sightlines from the lawn." She nodded. He didn't leave. Sarah. Her name in his mouth was a promise and a problem. When I look up in a room and see you, I remember that I'm not only a function. Her throat tightened. And when you look at me, I remember that I exist. Footsteps in the adjoining hall, voices, laughter, the clatter of a rolling cart, and the pantry swallowed its secret. He slipped out without another word, and the dark wood smelled for a second like improbable spring. The gala opened like a mouth. At 7, cameras arrayed along the front steps fired to life. At 7:16, the governor's office sent a deputy who smiled as if born to it. At 7:41, a society columnist brushed Luca's sleeve and purred for a quote about philanthropy. He gave her the sentence he had prepared, smooth as a blade that didn't show blood. He was good at this theater. The tilt of the chin, the half-laugh that implied nothing stuck, the handshake that told powerful men they were recognized and contained. Upstairs, Sarah drifted between doorways and shadow, a lantern no one could see. She learned the strange arithmetic of wanting to watch and needing not to be seen. From the attic landing she could see a sliver of chandelier and the sheen of Luca's hair when he turned toward the bar. From the mezzanine that staff used to cross unseen, she watched the quartet lift a waltz that lifted spines. Twice in 2 different rooms, he looked up, not at the crowd, not at the camera, but at the space where she stood. Twice she dropped her gaze, obedient and alive. At 9:03 p.m., she pushed open a service door to the west lawn for a breath of cold. A hedge rustled somewhere beyond, and she stepped back, certain she had imagined it. At 9:07 p.m., a man in a black jacket crouched behind that hedge with a camera fitted with a lens that could turn distance intimate. He had the feral patience of men who eat by stealing moments. The first click caught Luca in profile as he moved through a corridor toward a side staircase. The second framed the empty angle of the landing and Sarah's shadow against the wallpaper. The third, ruinous, found them on the narrow service stairs. She descending, he ascending. A single step between them, their eyes meeting in a line of light. No touch, no sin, only an expression that told a truer story than bodies could have dared. The photographer smiled, a wolfish little smile. He didn't need scandal to be explicit. He needed the suggestion of it sharpened by a legend's name. He slipped sideways through shrubs, kept low along the stone perimeter, and later that night uploaded the files with a subject line he knew would get opened. King and Maid. The mansion didn't know it had been bitten until morning. At 6:01 a.m., Sarah woke in her attic room to a knock that carried authority and apology in equal parts. She pulled her sweater around her and opened the door. Luca stood there jacketless, hair damp from a shower taken too fast. He held his phone without ceremony and showed her what the world would see in an hour. Grain, light, the narrow staircase, the look. She felt the blood leave her face. "Fire me," she said, before she could stop the old habit of sacrificing herself to the first solution that promised quiet. "If you let me go this morning, they'll rewrite it as a misunderstanding, and I don't fire people for loving me," he said. The sentence landed with both hands. She tried to breathe and couldn't. "Then what do you do?" "I move you," he answered. "Or I marry you." The attic light flickered as if even electricity disbelieved. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because her mind refused an option that sounded like salvation spoken too fast. "You don't even know my tea," she whispered, clinging to something small enough to hold. "I take it too hot. I forget to wait." One corner of his mouth lifted. "I know." He tucked the phone away, gaze steady. "You don't forget to wait. You pretend patience because the world told you to, and you like your tea too hot because heat proves the cup is yours." She stared at the floorboards until their knots steadied. "If I stay, I become a weapon they can use against you. If I go, I become a story they can finish without me. If you stay, I become a man who stops pretending his life is a mausoleum," he said. "If you go..." He stopped, not because he lacked words, but because the words he had would have broken. "Pack a small bag. 10 minutes. We'll decide before the world decides for us." After he left, the room sat with her, the way rooms do when they know they're about to change owners. She folded 3 shirts as if folding prayers, tucked her Psalms book into the side pocket, and smoothed the bed she'd slept in, as if it might keep her shape. Downstairs, the staff's radio crackled with news, voices tightening around the word publish. The first site would go live by 8. The aggregator would follow by 8:07. The talk shows would feast at 9. She met him in the small study off the East Loggia. The room had the quiet weight of oak and old victories. He stood by the window, phone to his ear, issuing instructions that felt less like defense and more like a redrawing of maps. When he hung up, he didn't speak for a moment. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horizon he knows he has to cross. "Movement buys you hours," he said at last. "Marrying buys you silence from people who only honor boundaries they recognize. And from the ones who don't honor any boundaries at all." Her question tasted like salt. "From them," he said, "I buy something else." "What?" "Time to take their teeth." She should have been afraid of that sentence. Instead, she found in it a kind of relief. He wasn't asking her to be brave alone. He was telling her how he planned to stand. "Say the word," he said. "Move, and I'll take you to the safe house in Montauk. Marry, and I'll make a statement at 10. We'll file the license today and hold the ceremony when you can choose a dress without apologizing for wanting one." Her answer rose and retreated and rose again, a tide against ribs. "You're asking me to choose you," she said. "I'm asking if you already have." She didn't realize she had stepped forward until she felt the heat of him near her hands. "I wrote a letter to a ghost," she whispered, and a man answered. He exhaled like someone who had finally put down a weight. He reached, but not for her, for the pocket where her letter lived like a live coal. He removed it, unfolded it carefully, and returned it to her palm. "It belongs with the person who knows how to hold it," he said. Her fingers curved around paper that had ruined and saved her in the same week. She wanted to say yes and wait in the same breath. The clock on the mantel said 7:56. The world would speak at 8 whether they had decided or not. The phone on his desk buzzed, a new message sliding into view from an unsaved number with the easy confidence of men who believe themselves untouchable. "Call it off, or the next photo isn't a staircase. It's a grave." Under the text, a JPEG thumbnail, an aerial shot of the East Garden, the view a sniper would see. The roses were bright as targets. Luca's face changed, not to rage, but to something colder and more useful. He tapped once, saved the number, forwarded, issued a name she had never heard, and didn't need to. Then he silenced the phone and looked at her without flinching. "Move or marry, Sarah." Her heart slammed twice. Chose. "Marry," she said, the word small and immovable as a cornerstone. "If I must be a story, I'll be the one who tells it." He nodded, decision locking into place like the final bolt on a safe. "Then at 10, he said, "we make it true." He stepped closer, close enough that the world reduced to breath and salt and a future heavy with unknowns. He didn't kiss her. He pressed his forehead to hers, a contact that felt older than any ceremony. "I will not let them use you to hurt me," he murmured. "And I will not let them hurt you to shame me," she answered. The mantel clock ticked them forward, merciless and fair. The first headline hit the internet like a thrown stone. The second followed like a second stone, aimed lower. Outside, the ocean kept its own time. Inside, 2 people wrote a timetable the world hadn't planned for. When 10 o'clock comes and microphones bloom like a field of metal flowers, what will the king say, and who will believe him first? The wolves or the woman who just chose to stand at his side? The storm began the same morning the world decided to talk about them. By 8 a.m., Sarah's face, blurred but recognizable, had already appeared on gossip sites, whispered across talk shows, printed beside the words, "The Billionaire and the Maid." They dissected her background, hunted her past jobs, even traced her last foster address like it was a crime scene. They called her the girl who wrote a love letter to her boss. The article didn't care that she hadn't meant for him to read it. It didn't care that love, for her, wasn't a weapon. By 9, photographers stood at the iron gates, their lenses hungry for a glimpse of the tragedy behind the headlines. By noon, the housekeeper whispered that someone had called pretending to be a relative asking for Sarah's birth certificate. By 1, Sarah was gone. She didn't slam doors or write a goodbye. She simply packed the same worn suitcase she'd once arrived with, left a folded note on Luca's desk, and slipped out through the service gate while security argued with the press. The note was short, her handwriting trembling. "I won't be the weapon they use on you. I love you enough to disappear." The ink had bled slightly, as if the page had already been touched by rain. She took the first train heading north. The world blurred outside the window. Trees, rain, cities that weren't hers. By nightfall, she found a small furnished studio in New Jersey, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid in cash. She worked at a corner market, crocheted blankets for extra money, and tried to erase her name from the world's memory. Days became weeks. The silence she had once worshipped now cut her open. Every time the bell above the market door chimed, her heart leapt. Every stranger with dark hair and tired eyes looked for half a second like him. But he didn't come. She told herself she didn't want him to. Then one morning, 2 months after the storm, nausea woke her before dawn. It wasn't nerves, it wasn't flu, it was something deeper, a flutter, a warning, a miracle. The drugstore clerk smiled when she saw the test in Sarah's shaking hands. "First time?" Sarah nodded, barely breathing. She took the box home, followed the instructions like scripture, and waited. The little plastic window filled slowly, mercilessly, with 2 red lines. For a long moment she couldn't move. The room tilted, her pulse racing ahead of thought. Then the first tear fell. Not from fear, not only from fear, but from the impossible truth blooming inside her. She pressed her palm to her stomach and whispered, "You're real." The sound of her own voice broke something open. She sat on the bathroom floor until the light outside turned gold and thin. Then she began to laugh softly, the kind of laugh that sounds like surrender. She was alone, but not empty. Luca Ferrari searched every corner of the country. Private investigators, security networks, even street cameras. Nothing. She'd vanished as completely as a dream that refuses to be remembered. Every night he returned to the mansion that now felt like a museum of loss. The rooms she'd walked through still smelled faintly of lavender soap and courage. Her letter, the one he'd given back, lay folded on his nightstand, worn soft from his hands. He slept little. He ate less. When people mentioned her, he didn't answer. When they mocked the scandal, he didn't defend it. He simply waited for a sign that she still existed. That sign came on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a photograph from a market security camera. The image was grainy, but unmistakable. Her, 2 months older, thinner, with her hair pulled back and a softness in her face that hadn't been there before, a secret she hadn't told him yet. He didn't hesitate. That night the sky cracked open. Rain came hard, angry, like it had been saving itself for this moment. Sarah sat in her small apartment, holding the ultrasound slip the doctor had printed that morning. A blurry shadow, the outline of everything she loved and everything she feared. She was whispering the name she hadn't yet decided on when a knock echoed through the thunder. 3 slow knocks, steady, familiar. Her heart stopped. She opened the door. Luca stood there, drenched from the storm, his hair plastered to his forehead, jacket heavy with rain, eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. For a second, they just stared at each other. Then his gaze fell to her stomach. The fabric of her sweater couldn't hide the gentle curve. The air between them changed. Heavy, electric, sacred. "Mine?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She nodded once, eyes flooding. "Yours, only yours." Something inside him broke, something made of iron and silence. He stepped forward, closed the space between them, and fell to his knees on her worn carpet. His hands shook as he touched her, as if afraid she might vanish again. He pressed his forehead to her belly and exhaled a sound that wasn't quite a sob, and wasn't quite relief. "I searched everywhere," he whispered. "I left everywhere," she said softly. "I know," he breathed, looking up at her. His voice trembled for the first time she'd ever heard. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "You did," she answered, And then, almost smiling through tears, "And you found me anyway." "Oh," he stood, eyes searching hers. "Marry me. Because of the baby? Because of you," he said, each word like a vow. "Because I loved you before I knew your name, and I'll love you long after I forget mine." She tried to laugh, but it broke into sobs. "You don't even know my tea." He smiled faintly. "Too hot. You forget to wait." She laughed through the tears, shaking her head. "You remembered?" "I remember everything about you," he said, and pulled her into his arms. The rain roared louder, hammering the windows, drowning out the rest of the world. They stood like that for a long time, two people who had been broken in different languages and were finally learning the same one. When he kissed her, it wasn't the kind of kiss that promises forever. It was the kind that says we survived this far. He stayed through the storm. When morning came, he made her tea too hot on purpose and watched her smile through the steam. Then his phone buzzed. One message. No name attached. Just words that froze his blood. "Call off the wedding, or the next photo won't be of a kiss. It'll be of a funeral." He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he turned it face down, kissed Sarah's forehead, and whispered, "Nothing will touch you. Not again." But somewhere, in a city that had never forgiven him, someone else whispered back, "We'll see." The mansion did not welcome them back. It studied them first. Doors that once opened by habit waited a half-second longer, as if measuring whether the two who crossed its threshold were the same people who had left. They weren't. Sarah returned carrying a future against her ribs, and Luca returned carrying a decision that had hardened into bone. The first thing he changed was the air. Fresh paint erased the ghost of perfume in the master suite. New linen, new curtains, a bed that had never known another woman's sleep. "This room shouldn't remember what we didn't live," he said, and there was tenderness in the ruthlessness of it. She protested, out of respect, out of the old instinct to apologize for taking up space, but he shook his head. "Grief is not a museum," he told her. "It's a door. I'm done living behind it." He could not gift her anonymity, so he gave her structure. Mornings began with the doctor, blood work, vitamins, the quiet drum of a tiny heart that stole language from both of them. Then tutors, literature for breath, math for clarity, English diction refined into a silk that still belonged to her. She loved the way knowledge unlocked rooms inside her she hadn't known existed. "You've always been this capable," he said, watching her devour a chapter on market signals. "No one put you where the light could find you." Afternoons, while contractors softened the master suite into something warm and modern, Luca walked her through the house's new skeleton. Updated alarms, camera angles, blind spots patched with mirrors. He spoke to her as an equal, and the language of vigilance, angles, timing, contingencies became a shared dialect. "Stand here, not there," he'd murmur, guiding her a step left so a column and sconce turned her into a smaller target. "If you feel watched, look at glass, not people. Glass tells on everyone." He did not hide what he was. He didn't name it either. But when a black SUV lingered 1 minute too long beyond the iron gates and two men laughed without smiling, Sarah understood the city's older laws were taking attendance again. Publicly, Luca refused shame. At a press conference, he did not delegate. He faced the field of microphones, those metal flowers that bloom for blood, and spoke in the calm of a man unafraid to be quoted. "Ms. Thompson is my fiancée," he said, each syllable threaded with steel. "Speculate less. Live more." The line ricocheted across networks and fed a week of panels, but something else happened too. The temperature shifted. Scandal tired, narrative hardened. When wolves get bored, they hunt elsewhere. When men with grudges get bored, they sharpen. The first sharpened edge arrived under her car, a tracker the size of a matchbox, magnetized to the frame. It was one of Luca's men who found it, his voice easy as he slid it into a clear bag, but the veins in his neck told another story. "They want patterns," he said. "We'll give them noise." That night, the convoy changed routes 3 times, then parked in different garages while devices slept in Faraday pouches like muzzled snakes. The housekeeper, Joanna, sharp, loyal, exhausted by her own caution, started to set tea out in the mornings without being asked. "For the baby," she would say, but sometimes her eyes added, "For my conscience." Sarah treated her with the same gravity she gave doctors, aware that kindness can alter the Doppler of a room faster than security systems can. When the invitations for a hospital fundraiser went out, Sarah studied the guest list with the wide-eyed diligence of a woman who refuses to be surprised twice. Names with glossy reputations, names that hid older names underneath. "Who here hates you diplomatically?" she asked, fingertip hovering above a line of print. "Who hates you the way thunder hates silence?" Lucas smiled without humor. Both kinds buy tables. He began training her the way he trained the men who stood closest. Not to fight, he would not outsource that, but to decide under pressure. They cleared the library and drew routes with tape on the carpet. Door to stair, desk to alcove, terrace to hall. "You do not run in a straight line," he said, setting 2 fingers to her wrist until her pulse matched the pace he wanted. "You move in decisions." She learned the house like a chessboard whose squares shifted with the light. A week later, she moved through it with a grace that was neither timid nor theatrical. She had been folding herself small for years. Now she practiced unfolding without apology. Between lessons, life practiced itself on them. He'd pause a briefing because the baby kicked, eyes going bright as if witnessing a miracle stealthier than any he had engineered. She'd stop reading to watch him sleep for 20 minutes on the sofa, the vulnerability of a man unarmored reminding her that strength wears many faces, and exhaustion is one of them. When a florist delivered a dozen white roses to the service entrance, no card, Sarah didn't think anything of it until she smelled a cologne that wasn't Luca's in the tissue paper. At the bottom of the box lay an envelope with her first and last name inked in a hand that pressed too hard. "A king's seed belongs to the kingdom." No signature. A flat line of menace. She brought the note to Luca without folding the fear that came with it. He lifted the paper, inhaled once, and something ancient moved behind his face. "Victor," he said at last, not to her but to the room, as if the walls should record the name. "I taught him not to wear cologne on jobs. He only wears it when he wants to be noticed." His jaw flexed. "He wants me to notice." Victor had been at Luca's side since 19, quick, loyal, brilliant at logistics, dangerous in the way men become when gratitude curdles into entitlement. He had drifted in recent months, arriving half a beat late to meetings, laughing at the wrong volume. Luca had defended him because history is a guilty defense. Sarah heard the fracture now. "Had. You think he sent this?" she asked. "I think he let someone use his habits," Luca answered, and that was worse. The threat came with choreography. A paparazzo with a lens like a telescope appeared at the East Dunes the next day and was escorted away, grinning. A security camera in the nursery blinked to black for 30 seconds at 2:11 a.m., then to white snow, then to normal. Nothing missing, nothing broken, everything touched by a suggestion. At breakfast, the gate intercom buzzed 4 times in 10 minutes. Delivery, meter check, neighbor's driver, none of them true. This is how malice tests a perimeter, 1 feather at a time until the bird forgets it can fly. Luca widened the circle of protection. He rotated men, called in old debts, cut off 2 lieutenants whose loyalties sounded rehearsed. He began each day with 3 questions. Where are we soft? What did we miss? What would I do to me if I were them? Sarah watched the calculus and felt both safer and closer to the mathematics of danger. He would not let her be a symbol, and only a symbol. He insisted she understand the sums. "Tell me the worst-case route from the library to the nursery," he said one evening, tossing her the ring of door keys the house had trusted to head stewards for decades. She walked it aloud, through the East Hall, down the service stair, across the gallery, then stopped herself. "Not that way," she corrected. "That cuts us past 3 windows. Better to double back, take the back stairs, and use the secret door through the cedar closet." He smiled, not because she was right, but because she was thinking. "You're learning to see the house the way the house sees you." But kindness continued its small work, even in a siege. Maria, the cook with the church bell laugh, arrived one afternoon with a pot of caldo verde and a wooden spoon like a baton. "Eat," she ordered, swatting Luca's hand when he reached for a second bowl. "Not you, her." In the nursery, a rocking chair appeared without anyone confessing to buying it. The wood was warm and plain, the kind that turns lullabies into furniture. Sarah curled there after dinner, reading out loud to a person the size of a fist, and sometimes Luca listened from the doorway like a parishioner who finally believed the sermon might be for him. The night the house flinched, the sea wore a cold, polished moon. Wind ran its fingers across the hedges. Somewhere a latch kissed metal. Somewhere else a floorboard answered with old timber's complaint. Sarah woke into a silence that rang wrong. She lay still, breathing shallow, letting her hearing adjust until it separated wind from intent. There, soft, careful footsteps, where no one should be at that hour. She slid from the bed, bare feet learning the carpet's seams the way a pianist learns distance between notes. In the hallway, the night lights rendered the world in pewter. She reached the nursery door and felt, in the small hairs along her forearms, in the steady thud of the house's heart through the plumbing, the presence of someone on the other side. The monitor flicked to life on the credenza before she could touch the knob. The screen washed blue, then green, then showed the crib in grainy black and white, empty as it should be this side of birth. A shadow crossed the far wall. Not wind, not a staff member. A shape that flowed along the baseboard as if it owned the floor. Sarah's hand found the button under the chair rail that Luca had shown her, silent alarm, east wing only, and pressed. Somewhere below, a vibration ran through circuits she could not see. She held her breath. Another shadow moved. A voice, low, close, wrong, spoke her name once as if tasting it. Sarah. She froze. It wasn't Luca. It wasn't any of the men who would die for him. The syllables landed like coins on a closed fist. Downstairs, a door opened with purpose. Multiple footfalls, then a command. East wing. The shadow at the far wall paused, listening to the house listen to it. Sarah stepped back, measuring the distance to the master suite, to the cedar closet, to the little life under her ribs. When the nursery door handle turned a fraction, the sea seemed to tilt. How do you defend a future that hasn't yet taken its first breath? And when the door finally swings, who will be standing on the other side? The man she chose, or the past he can't stop from knocking? The handle stilled, as if whoever stood there could hear the house listening back. Sarah kept one palm on the chair rail's hidden button, the other on her stomach, counting her breath the way Luca had taught her. Slow, measured, mean it. Footfalls below multiplied, a ripple of response moving like current through wiring and men. The door edged open the width of a coin. A gloved hand slid in and found the inside latch as if it had practiced the room in daylight. Sarah stepped sideways into the slice of shadow between armoire and wall. No panic, only the bright clarity that sometimes arrives where fear should live. When the figure slipped through, backlit by the hall nightlight, he favored his left knee. Not staff, not wind, not Luca. "Sarah," he said low. The syllables dropped too heavy, a mouth that liked to own names. She didn't answer. She reached instead for the nursery humidifier's cord coiled on the floor and wrapped it once around her wrist, the way a sailor ties to a line. The man moved toward the crib, saw it empty, and smiled, an ugly little curl of contempt, then turned his head toward the master suite. He wanted the spectacle, not the child. He wanted them. "Wrong room," she said, and the sound of her own voice steadied her. When he pivoted toward the noise, she yanked the cord from the wall. The plug snapped free with a spark. She flicked the switch. The room dived darker. He swore. From the hallway, a whisper click, safety off. "East wing, now!" The intruder lunged. She didn't try to outrun him. She moved in decisions. One step left put the armoire between them. Another carried her to the rocker, the heavy maple one Maria had smuggled into the nursery. She shoved it hard with a boot. The chair crashed into his shins. He stumbled, caught himself on the dresser, knocked a music box that started to play a thin lullaby. The wrong song for this hour. The door blasted open. Two of Luca's men came in low and clean, light carving their sightlines. The first grabbed the intruder's gun hand. The second swept his legs. The carpet cushioned and muffled. The house swallowed the sound out of habit. The struggle was fast, brutal, practiced. A blade flashed, a forearm bled, a wrist cracked like a green branch. The gun skittered under the crib and died there. "Down!" one of them barked to Sarah without looking. She crouched behind the dresser, the humidifier cord still looped around her wrist like a primitive rosary. Then Luca filled the doorway. He wore no jacket, no tie, just a dark shirt, open at the throat, and the expression of a storm that had picked where to break. He took in the scene in one inhale. Sarah crouched, the men working, the gloved hand fist tight around nothing. The intruder tried to buck free. A knee pinned him. A breath later, plastic cuffs bit his wrists. "Clear," the first guard said, chest rising, falling. One down, two shadows seen on the south hedge. Gone. Luca stepped through glass moonlight and knelt in front of Sarah before she could stand. His hands hovered, not touching until her nod gave permission. Warmth closed around her forearms. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head and found her voice. "He went for the crib first, like he wanted me to watch him, not find anything." Luca's eyes altered by a shade only those closest ever recognized. He stood, turned. "Who sent you?" The man on the carpet laughed once, thin, bloody. He lifted his head enough to find Luca's face. "Victor says hello." The room moved without moving. The name hit the air like a thrown glass. One of the guard's jaws clenched. Sarah felt a tiny shock behind the sternum, as if a door she hadn't wanted to open had opened on its own. Luca didn't blink. "That's one man's mistake," he said evenly, "and the last order he'll ever give." The intruder smirked until he saw the thing that lived behind Luca's calm, the ledger that balanced, the math that always paid. He looked away first. "Get him downstairs," Luca said. Quietly. "Cameras on, hall clear. Call Dr. Meyer for the arm." He angled his head to Sarah, already offering a hand. "We're done in here." Only when the nursery emptied did she let the tremor in her knees be real. He felt it through his palm and drew her gently against his chest. His voice, when it came, was the voice he saved for a world reduced to two. "You pressed the alarm, you killed the lights, you moved exactly where I'd have moved you. You did everything right." "I was afraid," she admitted into his shirt. "So was I," he said. "That makes us careful. Careful keeps you breathing." He guided her back to the master suite, closed the door, and slid the extra bolt that had seemed paranoid when the locksmith installed it at noon. The ocean shouldered the cliff beyond the glass. He poured her water and made her drink, hands steady now that his were permitted to shake. "Victor," she said at last, placing the name between them like evidence. "You trusted him." "I fed him when we were poor," he answered, a plane of old pain crossing his face. "Taught him how to sign his name the first time a bank took us seriously. He learned too much and loved me too little." "Why betray you now?" "Because men who want thrones don't like seeing a crown become a ring." His glance dropped to her hand, though there was no band there yet. "And because someone older promised him a shortcut." "The rival," she said, "the one whose cologne had stained the florist's tissue." He nodded once. He didn't say Mafia. He didn't need to. The word hung in the wiring, in the way the house counted time between sirens. She realized then that loving him would always mean loving a man who had tamed a monster by becoming fluent in its language, and was now trying to teach their child a different alphabet. A rap at the door. "Boss," the head of security said from the hall, voice low. "Packages contained." South cameras pulled 2 more features. Masks, hoodie, height around 5'10". They had an exit vehicle on Shore Road. "We've got a plate. It's dirt." "Run it anyway," Luca said. "Wake whatever judge answers at this hour. I want warrants for everything we can name and for whatever we can invent a name for." He looked back to Sarah and, just for a second, let her see the cost. The night had taken inches from him. She reached up and touched the place near his temple where grief and fury lived side by side. "You can't fight this alone," she said. "I don't intend to," he answered. "I intend to fight it in front of everyone." She understood then what he meant to do. Not retreat. Not hide her in a safe house like a relic. He would build a stage and invite his enemies to sit under chandeliers and drink from heavy crystal while he rewrote the script. He would bait the trap with something the underworld never resisted, its own reflection. "Another gala?" she asked, half astonished, half afraid. "A benefit for the pediatric wing," he said wryly. "We'll fund 1,000 stitches and set one more that matters to me." "Victor will come," she said. "He'll have to," Luca replied. "He needs to be seen to believe he still exists." He crossed to the desk, lifted a small velvet box from a drawer, and returned to her with a line of humility that made him look young and very human. This wasn't supposed to happen after broken windows and plastic cuffs. He opened it. A ring the color of promise held the light and refused to let go. But nothing about us has happened the way stories teach it. Marry me anyway. Her yes was not a breath. It was a standing thing. He slid the ring home, and for a moment the house, this house that had learned to be a mausoleum, remembered how to bless. Wind touched the glass like a benediction. Somewhere, the music box in the nursery wound down by itself and went still. They stood there, 2 people plus a heartbeat, hearing the ocean tell its old story and adding theirs to it. Then the rest of the night arrived, statements to draft, patrols to double, phone calls that would set quiet machinery in motion. Before he turned to work, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Sleep if you can. I'll be 3 rooms away." "Not far enough to make me worry," she said, and the ghost of a smile loosened the iron in his jaw. She slept an hour, maybe 2, in shallow, tidal drift. When she woke, it was to the soft chime of a message delivered to a phone on his desk. He was gone to the East Gallery with the security team. Moonlight sketched the empty chair. She crossed the carpet, curiosity and caution walking together, and saw the text on the lock screen. No number, just a symbol like a struck coin, and words that clarified the night. "Tomorrow, bring the queen to the board, or watch the board burn." She felt the baby turn, a small, insistent answer to a threat that thought itself larger than life. She set the phone down and stared through her reflection into the dark glass beyond. The lawn silvered, the roses darker than blood. If the bait must glimmer under chandeliers, how do you enter a room designed to break you and walk out with the crown, the ring, and a future that refuses to be negotiated? No one could tell that the mansion had almost bled the week before. By sunset, it looked like a palace carved from starlight. Chandeliers glittered like galaxies. Polished marble reflected the orchestra's glow, and laughter drifted through the halls as if danger had never learned their address. But beneath the surface, every smile had an echo, every movement a shadow. This wasn't a celebration. It was a test. And everyone in the room was a piece on Luca Ferrari's chessboard. Sarah stood at the top of the grand staircase, radiant and trembling. The gown he had chosen for her, deep emerald silk, slit just enough to whisper power, clung to her like it had memorized her courage. The diamond ring caught the light as if the universe itself bowed to it. From below, Luca looked up and forgot how to breathe. He had seen her in fear, in silence, in tears, but never like this, walking through danger with the grace of someone who had already survived it once. "Are you ready?" he asked when she reached him. She met his gaze. "No," she said honestly, "but I'll walk beside you anyway." He smiled faintly. "That's all I ever wanted." Together they entered the ballroom. The air shimmered with wealth and gossip. Every step they took silenced a dozen whispers, replaced by 100 camera flashes. The world saw only beauty, the billionaire and the maid turned fiancé. But those closest to Luca's world saw the bait glittering beneath the diamonds. Victor would come. He had to. He wouldn't resist the chance to humiliate the man who'd built an empire without him. Luca's security men melted into the crowd. Tuxedos disguising holsters, champagne glasses disguising communication lines. The string quartet played something slow, elegant, masking the rhythm of the heartbeat in Sarah's throat. She leaned close, her voice barely a breath. "Do you see him?" "Not yet," Luca murmured. "But he's here." The words slid between them like the hush before a storm. Half an hour later, the air changed. It wasn't sight, it was instinct. A temperature drop, a vibration in the floor. The way Luca's eyes sharpened as if his soul had felt the shift first. Victor stepped out from the far end of the hall. Clean-shaven, impeccably dressed, smiling with the kind of confidence that only hatred can buy. He clapped, slow, theatrical. "Bravo, amico mio. You always did know how to throw a party." Every security guard tensed, but Luca raised a single hand. "No," he said quietly. "He's mine." Sarah could feel the air between them tighten like piano wire. Victor's gaze slid to her, sharp and deliberate. "So this is the new queen. I thought you preferred women who stayed quiet." Sarah didn't flinch. "And I thought cowards preferred to hide behind shadows," she said, voice steady. A murmur rippled through the guests. Victor's grin faltered. "You have spirit, signorina. That will make the funeral more dramatic." Luca's jaw flexed. "Touch her, and I'll end you before you finish your sentence." Victor said softly. "But you already did. You ended me when you chose her instead of loyalty. I built your empire with these hands, and you repay me with exile." "You sold information to men who wanted me dead," Luca said. "I gave you everything." "You gave me ghosts," Victor spat. "And now I'll return the favor." The ballroom had gone silent. The orchestra froze mid-note. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the lights flickered. A scream tore through the air, short, sharp, not Sarah's, but close enough to make Luca move. The chandeliers dimmed, glass trembled. The power cut for a heartbeat, and when the backup lights flared, Victor was gone. "Get her out!" Luca barked. But Sarah shook her head. "No, you said this ends tonight." He turned to her, fury, love, and fear colliding behind his eyes. "It does, but not with you in the line of fire." She held his gaze unyielding. "Then I'll be behind it. I'm not running again." He stared at her, this girl who had once been invisible, now burning like light itself, and realized she wasn't asking permission. She was choosing him, even in war. He pressed a gun into her hand, not to use, but to keep her alive. "Stay near the column. If you see anyone but me, aim low. The first shot is for warning. The second is for mercy." She nodded. "And the third?" He met her eyes. "There won't be a third." Outside, thunder rolled across the ocean. Inside, the storm was already breaking. Shots cracked in the corridor, quick, controlled, too close. Security shouted orders. Glass shattered near the terrace. Sarah crouched behind the marble pillar, pulse wild. Through the chaos she saw him, Luca, moving like the storm itself, precise, relentless, unstoppable. He cornered Victor near the balcony. Rain whipped in through the shattered doors, drenching both men in the kind of darkness that reveals everything. "You could have walked away," Luca said. "I did," Victor hissed. "And you sent hunters after me anyway. I'm just returning the favor." Luca raised his weapon, eyes hard. "Then let's end the balance." But Victor only smiled, that terrible knowing smile, and glanced past him. Too late for that. Luca spun just in time to see the red laser dot climbing Sarah's back from somewhere high above. "Sarah!" The gunshot came before the echo. She fell backward against the marble, the sound swallowed by the thunder outside. The crowd screamed, and time fractured into slow motion. Luca dropped his weapon, caught her before she hit the floor. "No, no, stay with me," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in years. Her fingers, trembling, found his cheek. "You promised," she murmured, blood glistening at the edge of her sleeve. "Nothing would touch me." He pressed her hand against his heart. "I lied." Then he lifted his head toward the balcony, toward the rain and the man who had taken everything he loved twice in one life. And the mansion that had been filled with music finally remembered the sound of war. For a heartbeat after the shot, the world became only pulse, hers, his, the house's. Then color and sound slammed back in. Rain tearing through the shattered terrace doors, crystal chiming on marble, a chorus of gasps that broke into prayer. Sarah's body slackened in Luca's arms, then fought to hold on, as if life itself were a rope and she refused to let it burn through her palms. "Look at me," he said, voice hoarse, anchoring her gaze with his. "Right here." She obeyed. Of course she did. The wound bloomed just below her shoulder, a cruel red crescent that promised pain without sentence. Not center mass, not fatal, if he moved fast. The laser dot vanished, then reappeared on the column behind them, jittering, high angle, bad wind, a rifle kissing a roofline. Luca pressed Sarah's hand tight against the wound. "Count with me," he ordered, dropping back into calculus to keep her awake. 10 down to 1. 10, she breathed. 9. He tore his jacket, bound pressure, and lifted her behind the pillar with a movement that had lifted men out of worse. 8. East roof. The head of security barked into his sleeve. South stair, go. 3 men broke from the ballroom and bled into the architecture. The string quartet, frozen mid-phrase, set their instruments down as if laying flowers and fled with the glittering crowd. Only the house stayed to watch. The house always stayed. Victor retreated to the terrace edge, half haloed by rain. "This is your future," he shouted over the storm. "Screams in rooms you thought you owned." Luca rose. He didn't shout back. Men like him rarely need volume. "You hired cowards to shoot a woman from a roof," he said. "Even betrayal deserves a better craftsman." Victor's smile trembled. "You made me into this." "No," Luca answered, leveling his weapon, not at Victor's heart, but at his hand. "I made you a brother. You broke it." The shot that followed was surgical. Victor's pistol spun across the wet stone and clanged against the balustrade. He howled, clutching a hand that would never aim clean again. Security flooded the terrace like tide. 2 pinned him, 1 cuffed him. Another read rights through rain that didn't care. Above, a red dot skittered, vanished, reappeared on slate. The shooter moving, panicked, learning too late that wind is honest even when men aren't. "Roof team," someone crackled. "Visual." A staccato of commands. A shout, "Drop it!" A weapon clattered across shingles, hands lifted to the sky like a bad prayer. The night exhaled. Inside, Luca was already on the floor with Sarah again, eyes moving the way triage eyes move. 7, she whispered, stubbornly working the count backward. He forced a smile that felt like penance. "You're late to your own bravery," he said, ripping a linen napkin, packing, tying. "Always have been." 6, she said, then winced, then, of all things, laughed once, breathless. "You're dripping on me." "It's nothing," he lied. It was rain, it was blood, it was the whole life he had learned to wear like a suit cracking open at the seams. Sirens approached, a chorus layered over strings that had fallen silent and the ocean that never did. "EMS is inbound," the head of security confirmed, hand to his earpiece. "Shooter in custody. Victor too." He glanced down at the ring on Sarah's hand and blinked hard once, as if that small light outshone the storm. "I told you I wouldn't run," Sarah murmured. "And I told you there wouldn't be a third shot," he said, "meaning I failed, meaning forgive me." She read it and shook her head. "You promised me truth," she whispered. "Don't break that one." He pressed his forehead to hers for the second time that night, the way men who believe in nothing still imitate prayer. "Not that one," he vowed. The ambulance stole her into clinical light. He followed in a second car with sirens eating distance. In the ER's fluorescent thrum, time lost its edges. Nurses cut emerald silk. A doctor's voice surfaced through the storm in his chest. "Clean entry, no exit. Lodged shallow. Lucky, very lucky." Someone cut away the linen bandage he'd tied, and another voice, soft, kind, said, "Whoever did this saved you minutes." He didn't say I did. He stared at his stained hands like they were maps of countries he refused to visit again. When they wheeled her to imaging, a tech paused at the doorway and glanced at her chart. "How far along?" she asked without prelude. Sarah answered, and the young woman smiled in that private way women smile at each other around miracles. She returned 10 minutes later with an ultrasound cart and a conspiratorial whisper. "We're not supposed to," she said. gel already warming in her palm. "But after a night like this, you deserve to hear a heartbeat." The room dimmed. The monitor blossomed into grainy cosmos. A pulsing star flickered in a river of shadow. Luca gripped the bed rail as if the planet were listening. The sound, when it arrived, filled all the parts history had scraped bare. A small, insistent drum insisting on future. He closed his eyes and let it revisit rooms where grief had slept. "Still with us," the tech said, quietly triumphant. "Still dancing." Sarah's laugh turned to tears at once. Luca didn't wipe them. He had learned some tears deserve air. He kissed her temple and looked at the black and white galaxy like a man who finally believed in constellations with his own name. By dawn, statements had been signed. Ballistics would marry rooftop rifle to rooftop shooter. Phone logs would braid Victor to a rival boss who'd fled state lines on a ghost train. Wire transfers would surface with the patience of facts. The DA, who didn't like owing anyone, owed Luca a nod anyway. "We have what we need," she said, "meaning you've danced in smoke for decades. This time you handed us fire." He returned the nod without triumph. He had learned too many times how expensive victory can be. He stood at Sarah's bedside when the room quieted. Weak light found her face. Without makeup and gown, without a chandelier making a religion of her bones, she looked exactly like the first morning he saw her place coffee on his desk. Steady hands, trembling heart, unstoppable. "Victor will talk," she murmured. "He already has," Luca said. "Not to me. To a man in a suit who hates the word family for how men like me use it." A corner of his mouth moved. "I told them everything they needed to hear, about the rival, about laundering through fake charities, about a florist who remembers cologne." He paused. "About what the east roof sees when the wind shifts." She considered that. A man rewriting his life not with apology but with choice. "The cost?" she asked. He looked past her, toward the corridor where the night's echo was still learning how to die. "Old loyalties don't like daylight. Some will call me traitor for burning the map." He returned to her eyes. "Let them. I'm not raising our child on a street that believes debt is destiny." "You're sure?" she pressed, not because she doubted, because she wanted him to hear his own certainty. He breathed out, old engines winding down. "Yes." She exhaled too, reached for his wrist, and guided his hand to the place where the heartbeat had thundered moments earlier. "Then teach them a new arithmetic," she said. "Start with us." 2 weeks turned into ceremony. The press expected spectacle. They received something quieter, more dangerous, a wedding that looked like truth. The chapel on the estate, once cold, once full of echo, wore lilies and late sun. Maria cried from the second pew. Joanna, who had confessed her bargain with fear, cried too and refused to sit, choosing to stand like penance and benediction both. Luca didn't invite half the city. He invited the ones who had stayed when the lights flickered. He wore a simple suit and the face of a man who'd dismantled a kingdom and built a home instead. Sarah wore ivory that forgave gravity. The bandage peeking beneath the sleeve had faded to a pale comet. When the priest asked the old questions, their answers sounded new. "I choose you," she said, "because love is a decision repeated." "I choose you," he said, "because power is only clean when it kneels. Rings found fingers, names found futures." Somewhere in the back, a reporter lowered her phone, then closed her eyes as if praying for her own life to change. They didn't dance long that night. They didn't need to. A storm flirted with the horizon and changed its mind. The ocean, faithless, faithful, licked the cliff and lay down like a dog at their feet. Spring arrived at the mansion like a verdict in their favor. The roses Sarah had insisted on pruning after the worst night returned furious with color, as if beauty had decided to hold a grudge against fear. The nursery learned the warm weight of mornings. On a rain-washed afternoon in March, the boy arrived with lungs that argued eloquently for existence. Luca's hands shook when he cut the cord. Sarah laughed, crying, the way women laugh when pain finally turns into a person. Gabriel, they named him, because angels are message and muscle both. Luca did not delegate midnight. He changed diapers with the concentration he used to reserve for balance sheets. He fell asleep once in the rocker with Gabriel on his chest and woke to Sarah watching him and the world he used to rule watching nothing at all. He understood then that conquest had a different shape than he'd been taught. Smaller, warmer, louder at 3 a.m. The baptism unfolded under a sky arrogant with blue. Guests came in better clothes and softer eyes. Marjorie Vass, queen of the sharpened column, stood on the lawn and lowered her pen. "I misread the story," she admitted to Sarah at the punch bowl. "It's not king and maid, it's man and woman." Sarah smiled and didn't gloat. "We all learn to read better," she said, bouncing Gabriel, who regarded the world with a seriousness that felt inherited. Later, with the house exhaling guests, they climbed to the widow's walk where wind writes its own vows. The sea below was a long, glittering sentence. Gabriel slept, a bundled parenthesis against Sarah's heart. Luca stood behind her and tucked a wild strand of hair where it belonged. "Do you still hear the past knocking?" she asked, not afraid now, only curious. "Sometimes," he said, honest. "But it knocks softer. And when it doesn't..." He kissed the place where her shoulder had healed, a pale moon of another life. Then we answered together. The house listened. A gull stitched white across blue. The roses below held their color like a necessary oath. Inside, the monitor in the nursery blinked to life and showed an empty crib. A second later, a nanny's gentle hand lowered Gabriel into frame. Safety, it turns out, is a choreography, not a promise. Luca laced his fingers through Sarah's. "I will always owe the people I once was," he said, gazing past the horizon where numbers and names used to matter more than breath. "But I don't owe them our son." She leaned into him, the wind a cathedral around them. "Then let's spend the rest of our life paying forward instead." He smiled, a rare, unguarded phenomenon made common by practice. Below them, the mansion, no longer mausoleum, no longer battlefield, learned a new language too. Laughter in hallways, lullabies on night air, the quiet heroism of ordinary days. Somewhere in the city, an old rival signed a plea. Somewhere else, Victor stared through glass at a sky that no longer changed for him. Their names would enter ledgers and leave them. The only ledger that mattered up here beat under a small blue blanket. As sun leaned west and ocean light turned honey, Sarah tipped her face to Luca's and kissed him. Not with the fever of survival, but with the calm of a country finally mapped. He tasted salt and spring and the simple pride of a man who had chosen his own ending. "Home," she whispered. "Home," he agreed. And if, one night years from now, the past knocks with new tricks and old teeth, the door on the cliff will still open, not to let danger in, but to let two people step out together and remind the dark what light costs and what it buys. If you enjoy stories like this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That's how I'll know you truly liked it. Even if you're watching on your TV, grab a second to join this family of fans who love emotional and heartfelt stories. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring you even more tales like this one.